Prisons are designed to isolate you. It's basically what they're for. All of those concrete walls, electric fences, guards, guns, it's all there to keep you isolated from the rest of society so that you can't commit any more crimes. Isolation can drive a man mad. They did an experiment where they got rats who had been kept in bare cages with no stimulus and compared their brains to those of rats who had been kept in what are referred to as rich environments, where they had things to interact with and play with and move around. The rats that had been kept in bare cages had shrunken brains. If you keep a man or a mouse in a bare, sterile room, their brains will shrink. People lose it. You go 6, 7, 8 months without speaking to anybody but your cellie. I've known cellies to get into fights, hurt each other, kill each other even. Some people hurt themselves. Suicide is always a concern. Some people hallucinate. You can legitimately lose your mental stability during a lockdown. I always considered myself to be pretty stable. I thought I was grounded, that I had a good grip on things. I'd do what I could to keep my mind active. I'd read every day. Even if it was just the same book that I read the day before, I'd read it again. I would do religious correspondence courses that are offered free of charge to inmates from various nonprofit groups. I'd suck up any nonfiction I could get my hands on. I'd write until my wrists hurt. These were all things I could do to try and keep my mind active. Most important was the visits. High Desert is in Susanville, which is just way the heck out in the middle of nowhere in Northern California. In order to visit me, my wife had to go over Donner Pass, which is a significant trial. As a result, she wasn't able to visit me every weekend. It was every other weekend I'd get to see her. It was during one of these visits that I realized that lockdown fever may have crept in, that I might not be as stable as I thought I was. I was dressed and waiting for my visit. They were going to announce on the institutional PA inmate channel, you have a visit, get ready, they're going to escort you to the visiting room. And I was waiting, and my wife was late. As I was waiting, my cellmate, Scooby, turned on the TV, right to the news, and they mentioned that there was a terrible storm that had unexpectedly hit Donner Pass, that cars were stuck, that people were being advised to not try to go over the pass. My heart started racing. I immediately realized my wife was stuck in that. She could be hurt. I started pacing back and forth in the cell, my mind racing. It's hard to explain how quick your mind can go from one end to an extreme whenever you're stuck in a little box like this. Just over the course of 15 minutes, I went from considering the possibility that my wife had been harmed, to being afraid of it, to being terrified of it, to knowing that it had happened, that she was stuck up there, that she had gotten into an accident, she'd fallen into a gorge, she was dead or hurt in an ambulance. It just took minutes for this to become a certainty. I knew it had happened, and I didn't know what I was going to do. Scooby was patient with me. I'm sure that my pacing back and forth and the 10-foot walkway on our cell was pretty annoying pretty quick. But he'd seen the same newscast that I had. He understood why I was concerned. And as I was slowly working myself up, an officer came to the door, knocked on the door. I was so relieved. This would be my visit. He was going to tell me it was time to go to a visit. And he yelled, "Hey, Channel, you got to cuff up. You have a phone call. Somebody called the institution and wants to talk to you." This was unheard of. My heart sank down to my feet. I did 17 years. In that time, one time, I got a phone call from outside of the institution where they told me, "Hey, come talk on the phone." And I literally never saw or heard of it happening to anybody else. The only thing that was even remotely similar is that sometimes whenever a family member of an inmate would be dying, terminal in the hospital, since the hospital wouldn't accept phone calls from the prison, they would arrange for the person on their deathbed to call the prison and they would give the inmate an outside phone line in order to say goodbye to their loved one, speak to him a final time. My heart was in my feet. I knew what this was. This wasn't just me imagining things anymore. This was really happening. Somebody had come to my door and told me to go get on the phone. I put on the handcuffs and walked to the little room they had. They took off the cuffs and gave me the phone. And I picked it up with the sure knowledge that this was perhaps the prison chaplain calling to tell me that my wife had died. That was his job, was to speak to inmates whenever their families had died and try to console them. And that has to be a terrible job he had. Or possibly it was my wife, that she had somehow arranged to call the prison and that they had gotten through and she only had a little bit of time left. I picked up the phone and I said hello, and it wasn't my wife. Of course it wasn't. I'd worked myself up into a frenzy because of that lockdown fever. It was completely unrelated. Somebody who worked in the mailroom, an officer, wanted to speak to me to make sure that I had properly filed a report that he submitted a couple of days earlier. I calmly as I could, I was still shaking, I was so tense, I explained to him that I hadn't been to work in over 2 weeks because we were on lockdown, and that he would have to speak to one of the members in the administration to find out if it had been filed. He thanked me, I got put back in my cell, and I was mostly concerned with looking stable, acting stable. There's 40 inmates always at their doors watching what's going on in the day room, and I knew there were a lot of people assessing my condition, trying to figure out what was going on with therein. I got back to the cell and I went back to pacing, waiting for my visit, which never came. I didn't get my visit that day, or the next day. It was a week later whenever I finally found out what had happened. Ordinarily, if you have this moment where you're worried about a loved one, you just need to know they're okay because you have this crazy idea that won't go away, you pick up a phone and call them. I wouldn't be touching a phone for weeks, months even. We were on lockdown. I could have sent out a letter, but with how long it took to get letters out of the institution and how slow the mailroom was processing letters, I wouldn't have gotten an answer back for probably over a month. So I paced back and forth in this little 10-foot cell, hoping, praying, working myself up. It was an exhausting week until finally the next week, right at the first visiting slot, they announced, "Hey, Channel, you have a visit," and I went to see my wife. She was fine. What had happened is that the storm had hit her and her friend who drove over the pass regularly, unexpectedly. Donner Pass has bad weather. This wasn't a unique storm. It wasn't the only time a storm like this hit Donner Pass. It's famous for being the place where the Donner Party had to resort to cannibalism in the year 1846 because they were snowed in. It has some of the worst weather in the United States. They had had to pull over to a rest stop and to sleep in their car until the storm abated and a snowplow came and got them out. There had been no way for them to visit. But she was okay. And that was really all that I cared about. I was relieved, I was ecstatic, and that was one of the best days of my life, where the week before had been one of the worst. And it makes me think about taking your loved ones for granted. The day before, I thought that something may have happened to my wife. I would have told you she was the most important person in my life. I would have told you that I didn't know what I'd do without her. But they would have been words. Whenever confronted with the knowledge that I may have lost her, the fear that I may have lost her, they weren't words. They were as real as an emotion gets. It's too easy in everyday life to let somebody stop being so important to you, to stop having that "they're important to me, I don't know what I'd do without them" be a real emotion that you feel down to the core of your being. If you catch yourself taking for granted somebody who is important to you, take that moment and imagine being stuck in that box for a week, pacing back and forth, not knowing if they were okay. And once you really internalize how god-awful that would be, what it would feel like to lose them, go and tell them how important they are to you and how you are glad that they're in your life. Because people can be taken from us. And the last thing any of us want to do is leave something that important unsaid.